Hey everyone, my name is Mr. Herzl. I'm the Social Studies Coordinator at Life Schools, and whether your teacher has directed you to listen to this lecture for the first time, you don't know anything about the New England area and how it was settled, or whether you've already heard this information from your teacher and you're just coming here for a review, either way I'm going to help you understand the Puritans and how they settled. So it's really the New England area that was settled originally by the Pilgrims and then later on the Puritans, and they all kind of became one society because they had a lot of similar values. So let's get started with it. First off, there's some review questions to kind of see what you remember about our lecture over the Virginia colony. So what was the first British colony in North America? That was the Virginia colony. Now, you may have said the Jamestown colony. The Jamestown was actually a settlement, and I guess it was the only thing there originally, but it eventually became a settlement that was a part of the Virginia colony. And so we think of Virginia as the first colony. The Virginia Company is what kind of company hoping to make a profit? The joint stock company. Remember, it's kind of like stocks today. You can invest in back then you could invest in a company, and a bunch of people would invest, and they would each have a small amount of ownership hoping to make a profit. And remember, they wanted to make a profit because they knew people had done the same thing and been very successful, or that Spain had done kind of the same thing and been very successful with their overseas exploration. Who introduced tobacco to Jamestown as a source of income? Remember, they didn't have any gold there, so they had to figure out a different way to make money. That was John Rolfe. What is an indentured servant? Someone who had their passage to America paid for, but had to pay it back by being a servant for a certain number of years. What group of people replaced indentured servants as the primary source of labor in Jamestown? By 1700, slaves had replaced indentured servants, and we kind of talked about that in the last lecture about how that kind of happened over time. And originally, it was mostly indentured servants, and then there was a Portuguese ship that ended up being taken over by the English and brought there, and it had Africans on the ship, and so we don't know if they became slaves at that time or indentured servants, but eventually the slave trade becomes fully enforced there in the colonies there. All right, and these are just a bunch of them. I guess the PowerPoint doesn't have it all one by one, so I'll have to fix that. But you can go over these if you'd like. What was the first successful British settlement in North America? Jamestown. John Rolfe introduced what item? Tobacco. What was the first legislative assembly in North America? The House of Burgesses. Poor farmers suffering from low tobacco. What happened because of that? Bacon's Rebellion. And that also led to a decrease in the amount of indentured servants and an increase in the amount of slaves. Remember, indentured servants would eventually become free, and so that kind of created a group of people there that had the ability to rise up and rebel against the wealthy landowners. So they didn't like that, so eventually more and more they're going to pick slavery over indentured servitude. All right, John Smith took control of what colony and said, "He who will not blank will not blank. He who will not work will not eat." You had a bunch of people who were kind of rich kids that had come over there, and they didn't want to get their hands dirty and work. They wanted to get a quick get rich quick by finding gold. And he said, "Listen, there's no gold here, there's no silver here, there's only an ability to work agriculture. So if you're not going to work, then you're not going to eat." All right, John Rolfe introduced tobacco to newly formed colonies because it is what type of crop? It's a cash crop. You can harvest it, bring it overseas, and make a lot of money. So again, every time you see this, what you're seeing is what's important to the state of Texas as far as what teaks are important to them. So the ones that are in red are ones that we really need to focus on. The ones that are in black are things that we kind of already know because we're talking about this time period anyway. So religious reasons for colonizing versus Virginia's economic reasons. We learned that Virginia was colonized because of economic reasons, and so we're going to learn today that Massachusetts was colonized mainly for religious reasons. 8.1c, explain the significance of the date 1620. And that date, what is significant about it is the Mayflower Compact. The Pilgrims came there and they signed the Mayflower Compact. They came to the Massachusetts area, what we now know as Massachusetts. 8.3b, analyze the importance of the Mayflower Compact. So we already kind of just talked about that, and we're going to talk about all these obviously in depth in just a little bit. 8.15a, identify the influence of ideas from historical documents, including the Mayflower Compact. So the state of Texas really wants you to know what's important about the Mayflower Compact. So we're going to spend some time on that, and you will know that. So, and again, if you want to know what's going to be on the STAR test when it comes to anything having to do with the Pilgrims, it's probably going to be the Mayflower Compact. Okay, so one of the questions we're going to ask today, in what ways was colonial New England different from colonial Virginia? And hopefully you'll be able to answer that by the end of this lecture. So the colonists who first settled in New England came for religious reasons. Religious disagreements in Britain led to the divisions in the Anglican Church. So here's how that works. I'm going to get my pointer out here so I can show you. Here's my laser pointer. So the early Christian church here is split between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, and that's very, very early. And then you have this split at the Reformation with Martin Luther. Now, we're not talking about Martin Luther King Jr., which you might be familiar with. This is Martin Luther, who was a Roman Catholic monk, and he basically, he wrote the 95 Theses and hammered them to the door of the church and said, these are all the things that are wrong with the Roman Catholic Church. And so his group of people split off and they became Protestants. Now, if you go to church and you are not Roman Catholic, if you go to a Christian church and you're not Roman Catholic, then you're most likely a Protestant. Almost everyone who goes to church who isn't a Roman Catholic is a Protestant. Not everyone, but a lot of people. And then Protestantism is going to break off into all these different things. Obviously, Martin Luther, so you see this Lutheranism. Anglicanism was made because, Anglicanism is the Church of England. So when you hear Anglicanism, you can think Church of England. And then all these break off of there. And then Calvinism is going to break off as well. And that's called what we call today Reformed theology. So that's kind of a lot of information to take on, but you have to understand it if you're going to understand the Pilgrims and the Puritans. So here's the story on the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims are what they call separatist in England. There are two types of people who don't like the Church of England during that time. There are Puritans who want to purify the church, and there are separatists who think, you know what, the Church of England, Anglicanism, is so far gone, it is so corrupt that there's no way we can fix it, and we're going to separate from it. And so you're going to see both of those in this lecture. Okay, so Puritans are going to believe in the Calvinist idea. Remember, Puritans, purify the Anglican Church of England, and those are the things, same thing. Anglican and Church of England are the same thing. Purify that church. That's what they believed in. Puritans believed in the Calvinistic idea of predestination, and they tried to live strictly Christian lives without sin. Okay, they believed that the Anglican Church compromised too far, and the reason why that, I said that it was so corrupt that they wanted to purify it. Well, the reason why is because there were Catholic rituals in the Anglican Church, and that's kind of a whole other part of history that we can talk about. The Anglican Church only came about because a king wanted to divorce his wife, and the Pope wouldn't let him. And so England said, the king said, okay, I'm just going to make my own church. And he came up with the Anglican Church of England church. And so obviously it's going to have a lot of the same attributes as Catholicism. but they just call it something different. And so, these people down here, they're like, hey, that's not right. We shouldn't be Catholics. We're not Catholics. We're Protestants. And so we need to purify that out of the church. Some radical Puritans are known as separatists, and so this is what the Pilgrims are going to be. They're going to be separatists. They want to separate because they're unwilling to wait for church reforms. Either they're unwilling to wait, or they just don't think those reforms are going to happen. Separatists are going to become Pilgrims when they formed a joint stock company. But even before that, there's a story to the Pilgrims that's not really told in this slide. So the Pilgrims are separatists, and at first they go to, well, obviously they're separatists, so they want to leave. They want to get away. They want to separate from England. So the number one place with religious freedom during that time is Holland. Holland, and if you say someone is Dutch, they're from Holland, which is kind of weird. I don't know. If you say someone's Swedish, they're from Sweden. So I don't know why it's Dutch from Holland. There's probably a reason, and I'm just not smart enough to know. But anyway, they went to Holland and lived with the Dutch, where there was religious freedom. You could believe whatever you wanted. But the problem with that is that if you believe whatever you want and it's religious freedom, as in our society today, we don't force anyone to believe anything. And so what you get is a lot of godless people that don't believe in anything. And what comes along with that is people doing whatever they want, not living by a moral code. So the Pilgrims come to Holland and they're in the middle of this. Yes, they have religious freedom. They can do whatever they want. But now they're living in a place where all these people are living these, what they believe is just terrible, sinful lives. And so they say, this is not a good fit for us. And so 35 of those people decided to migrate to America, where they hope their English identity could still get them into the Virginia colony. But they would be able to separate from the Church of England. It would be so far away. They could get into England because they were still, or they could get into Virginia because they were still English. And remember, Virginia is an English colony. But they knew they would be so far away from England that they could kind of live the way that they wanted to live. And so they're going to get together with a bunch of people and have these Puritans who kind of funded them in this joint stock company, and we already know what that is. But these funders in the joint stock company were more just, they were religious traders and kind of wealthy merchants that were kind of sympathetic to the religious reasons why they wanted to go. So they got together with them and they created the Plymouth colony in America. So what happens is after they secure that backing from those sympathetic Puritan merchants, William Bradford is going to be the leader who's going to go with, like I said, 35 pilgrims are going to go over who are, again, separatist. They're Calvinist, Reformed separatist, separation from the Church of England. And so William Bradford's leading it, and then 60 other immigrants went as well. Now, what happened is as they sailed for Virginia, they actually ended up landing way up north, which is in present-day Massachusetts, or what we might consider the New England region. And so they kind of had a problem. If they're going to Virginia, they had to live by the laws of Virginia that England had set up. But now they weren't in Virginia. And so what happened is that they were outside of the jurisdiction or Virginia's rules. They were outside of where Virginia's rules applied. And then there was no charter. They didn't have any instructions from the king. So they didn't really have anything to go by when it came to rules. So they said, well, we need to pick something that we all agree to as rules on how to make this successful. And so that's called the Mayflower Compact. Again, very important. The state of Texas wants you to know this for your test. And so what that really is it's all of them agreeing to this set of rules, and they're coming together as a civil body politic. So they're all getting together, they're all agreeing to these rules and saying, we will live by this, we all agree to it, and if one person breaks these rules, then there will be consequences. So it's considered the first constitution adopted in North America. And that's what's so important. That's why the state of Texas wants you to know, because it's literally the beginning form of our Constitution that we have today. It's the first constitution in the newly developed North America, or newly European discovered North America. Okay, so when the Pilgrims found Plymouth in 1620, they faced disease and hunger. And the reason why is because one of the reasons they got blown off course was because there was a storm and there were some other things. It's really an interesting story if you ever read it. One of their masts broke, and they were only able to fix it because somebody had the specific piece with them to fix the mast, and all kinds of things like that happened. But they ended up landing in November. Now, November is very close to December, January, February. This is winter time. And if they were in Virginia, that wouldn't have been a big deal because it's further south. But if you've ever been up in the northeastern portion of the United States during winter, it gets very, very cold. Now, this was a good thing and a bad thing. So the cold actually kept a lot of diseases at bay. So there's no mosquitoes like they had in Virginia that were carrying malaria and things like that. So the climate was good for that, but it was also bad because they didn't have enough food to survive, and they didn't have enough time to prepare for the winter that was coming on them in the snow and the cold. So they had a very hard time. So 50 out of 100 people died because of that. And so it was only until they got help from a local tribe that they were able to survive and thrive. So very interesting. I think this is one of the most interesting things about the Pilgrims' history. So the Pilgrims show up, and amazingly, the first Native American, or one of the first, it's reported as the first, it may have been one of the first they came in contact with, was a man named Squanto. And the reason why it's amazing is because Squanto spoke English. Like, there's no Native Americans, hardly any, that speak English. So if you're the Puritans and you're showing up in this far-off land, you got blown off course, you don't even know where you are, you show up, and the first Native Americans that you talk to, you're not going to expect them to speak English. But what had happened was Squanto had been a part of a different tribe, and he had ended up for some reasons going over to England. That's a whole nother story that we don't really have time to tell, but it's very interesting if you ever want to look up the history of Squanto. But he ended up going over to England and living there a number of years, and then returning back to America. And when he got back to America, his tribe was mainly wiped out. And so he joined the Wampanoag tribe, and the Wampanoag tribe are the first ones who the Pilgrims make contact with. Now, if you're the Pilgrims, you came over because you're very religious, and you're thinking this is God's will that we do this, that we separate from the Church of England, that we come and make our own, what later will be, our city on a hill is what they called it. But if that's your thought process, and all of a sudden you show up and the first person you talk to not only speaks English, but because he speaks English is able to tell you all these different things about how you can survive in this, very strange, unfamiliar territory that you're not used to, you're going to see that as a sign from God that it's a blessing, that you're doing the right thing. And that's exactly what the Pilgrims thought. So the first years, they're very friendly with the Native Americans there, and the first Thanksgiving is an actual thing. It actually happened. Whether or not it's like this picture, who knows? Probably not. But it actually did happen, and it was to give thanks for the blessings that had been brought by those Native Americans, and Squanto being able to speak English and being able to bridge that gap between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims. When the separatist Pilgrims came to America, the Puritans remained with the Church of England. So the Puritans are not going to be coming over yet. All right, they're not going to be there yet. But what is going to happen is that in 1633, the king chose this guy named William Laud to be the head of the Church of England. And this guy hated Puritans, hated them with a passion. And so because he's put in charge of that church, he's going to run all of these ministers out who are Puritans of the Church of England. He's going to banish them. Anyone who's a Puritan, who's a part of the Church of England, he's going to basically kick out. And so, where are they going to go? Where can we go and still practice what we believe? Well, America was an obvious choice. You also had people there that were being successful and who believed things that were very similar to what you believe. The only difference between the Pilgrims and the Puritans is that the Pilgrims thought there was no way to change the Church of England, and the Puritans want to purify it. But they both had the same goals. They both believed in the same things. In 1630, the Pilgrims arrived in Boston, and so 900 Puritans are going to board 11 ships and head for America under the leadership of a guy named John Winthrop. He's a very important person. In fact, that quote that I said before, we're going to be a city on a hill, that is what he says prior to getting to where they were going there in Massachusetts. So he establishes the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is present-day Boston. If you've ever been to Boston, you've been to where they established their colony. And over the next decade, 10,000 Puritans came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, along with 10,000 other people that just were immigrating from England for various reasons. So this colony grows very quickly. From 1630 to 1640, Puritan leader John Winthrop, the guy I just talked about, he led 16,000 Puritans to Massachusetts Bay. So even more. So the numbers are here and there. The source that I was just talking about said 10,000, but this is saying 16,000 Puritans. It was a good number of people that came over. That's really all you need to know. Numbers are not important when it comes to history. Just understanding the concepts are. Okay, there you go. There's the city on a hill to be a model for other Christians, the quote that I spoke of. All right, so how is Massachusetts different from Virginia? Well, Puritans came to America for religious reasons, but not only that, Puritans came to America for land as well. So they both kind of had that goal, but, well, not necessarily. Virginia is a monetary system. That you want to make as much money from growing things. And really, the reason why they came originally was they wanted to make as much money as they could from gold. But the reason for the Puritans coming to America was really, their main reason was legitimately religious freedom. Okay. The other thing that's different is Puritans usually came as families. We talked about in the other lecture that in Virginia there was very few women and not a lot of children, and that's completely different in Puritan New England. So Puritans come with their families. There's many more women there and many more children there than in the Virginia colony. Settlers sacrificed for the common good. They built schools, and they focused on subsistence farming. So it was really about making enough, growing enough crops, growing enough food to help us all survive. It wasn't let's make as much money as we can, and survival is kind of secondary. Those are the problems that that's what led to the problems in the Virginia colony until John Rolfe showed up. That's what was going on. People were just worried about making money, and he said, hey, listen, man, if we can't eat, we can't make any money. So, if you're not going to work, you're not going to eat. But that wasn't a problem here in New England. Right? And again, New England was a more healthy place to live than Virginia. So colonists tended to live longer there. Some of the other things are that they did not believe in the headright system. They gave title of township to a group of men who distributed the land among themselves. So remember, the headright system says, hey, we're going to give you 50 acres for every indentured servant that you bring over. And so people were bringing a ton of indentured servants, but all that land went to one person. This is different. They would give a bunch of land to a group of men, and they would say, you guys are going to split it up. And of course, wealthy men who were more established in the community would get more land than others, but everybody, even the poor people, got a small bit of land. So let's talk about the social hierarchy in New England territory. Religious leaders are obviously going to be at the very top of New England society. So the people who are kind of running, it's different than today. We talk about religious freedom today. In New England, there wasn't really a ton of religious freedom, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But the people who were the religious leaders were also the political leaders in the very beginning of New England society. The majority of the New England population were small-scale farmers who were loyal to the local community. So it's those men that had been given, they give a group of men a township, and they split that land up between them. The bottom of the society was the small population of poor, landless laborers and servants. And a lot of times those are going to be those other immigrants that come over and are not religious, or not a part of they're not a part of the church. Maybe not because they may want to be a part of the church, but you had to do a lot of things to become an official member of the church. Even later on, even the kids of church members who had come over and founded the colonies, or their grandkids or great-grandkids, they even had a hard time sometimes becoming full members of the church because of the requirements. All right, so government in the New England colonies centered on church through town meetings. Okay, so it could be used, that slide was obviously, it could be used for a church or a town meeting. And that's what happened. So each New England town was independently governed by local church members. So each town had a system where they would have yearly meetings and people would come together and they would elect officials who would run their towns. They were all the adult, not all, so women weren't, but all adult male church members were allowed to vote for local laws and taxes. And this is really important. So if you look at it in terms of what we don't want to do is we want to stay away from judging people in the past by our standards today. And so if you looked at their society and you said, well, these guys were, male chauvinist and pigs, and well, that might be all true compared to our society today. But back then, this society was very progressive. Even though it didn't have religious freedom and women couldn't vote, it was very progressive because it gave all men the ability to vote. There wasn't slavery in this society. So, this is the beginning of what will eventually become, will lead to freedom for all. It's the beginning of what will eventually lead to the beginning concepts of what will eventually lead to voting rights for all, those kind of things, even though they didn't display that then. So that is a big deal that all adult male church members were allowed to vote. So a town would vote for its representatives, and those representatives would go to what they called the general court, and they would represent that town, and they would go and vote for different things. And that's really important. So the reason why that's important is because that's basically the beginning of our system today. If you go to Washington, D.C., what you see is, if you go to the Congress or the Senate and you look at what we've got going on there, those are representatives from right here, wherever you live, you have a representative that represents you in Washington, D.C. And so this is the very beginning forms of that. And we see a lot of the beginning forms of a lot of things from our government in the Puritans society here in New England. Right. As a Massachusetts colony grew, it spawned 4 new colonies: New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New Haven, and Connecticut. All still a part of the Massachusetts colony. And so we still call that New England today. Right. So Connecticut's important for creating the first written constitution in the U.S. called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. One of the things that we're going to see, though, is that because they were very religious people and they did not believe in the idea of free, I said that a lot of our ideas that we see now in our country, originated with this Massachusetts colony. But that's also we're not going to see a lot of the things, some of the things that we hold dear today, like religious freedom. And so there are certain people that get banished from Massachusetts for different things. Like Roger Williams is going to be banished for demanding that Indians be paid for their land. And that's not necessarily completely true. So we use these PowerPoints, but not all of them are completely, not everything or I can't say it's not accurate. What I'll say is it is disputed by historians. What we do see a lot of in in New England is people paying Native Americans for their land. So there's a lot of that, but there's also people that disagreed with that. So that's that. The other one is Anne Hutchins. She's a very interesting case. Anne Hutchins was a part of the Puritans, and she actually was really very religious, so religious in fact that she said that she had visions from God, and she started to preach for herself. And she had this idea that everyone was saved by grace, that you didn't need to do works, which is actually, if you look at it, very similar to what Martin Luther believed with the Protestant Reformation. He didn't go so far with the grace aspect of it, but the idea that, God has made you perfect, and because of that, then you're good. You're okay. You don't have to do all these things to become, to go to heaven. He's already perfected you with grace, and that's how God sees you. And Anne Hutchins really believed that, and that's really kind of what more modern Reform people think even today. But they didn't like that, and they especially didn't like the fact that she was preaching. So this is asking what's going on in this image, and what is going on in this image is issues that came from wars and problems with the Native Americans and the Massachusetts colony. And so we are going to see that, and that's what we're going to talk about here. It starts out as a good relationship between the Pilgrims and the original natives that they met, but it's going to eventually kind of go south to some extent. So as the New England colonies expanded into new lands, conflicts with natives arose. The Pequot War in 1637 was the first major British-led attack on Indians, and it led to the death of 600 Indians. And so really the Pequot War is, well, just to give you a structural context here, you need to understand that when the Europeans come over, whether they're in Virginia or whether they're in New England, and all the way up and down, and even as we expand the United States, we become the United States and expand, different tribes are constantly trying to ally themselves or become our friends or become friends with the Virginia colony or the Massachusetts colony. And so once they ally themselves, once they become friends with the colony, then the reason why they're trying to do that is because they know that Europeans have power, have things like guns, and have technology like steel that they don't necessarily have. And so they know that those things can help them fight tribes that they've been fighting for any number of years. So this becomes, a lot of times the historians try to talk about, it's a fight between the settlers and the Indians. Well, that's not always the case. Sometimes it's a matter of the Indians who are siding with the settlers fighting against another tribe, or a tribe fighting against them. So that's some context to what we're going to talk about here. So the Pequot War was the beginning of that, between the it's a British-led attack on the Indians, but there's a lot more to that story. If you want to look it up, I'll put a link in the description on YouTube that you can see. King Philip's War is really kind of the last push for New England Native Americans to fight against and push out European colonists out of their areas. And it breaks out in 1675 when the Wampanoag Indians raided towns, killing 10% of colonial New England men. And so they are, originally the Wampanoag had become friends with the Pilgrims, but eventually that, over time, that's a long time since this time of 1675, and so eventually what happens is they decide this isn't a good idea, and it's much more complex than that. Again, I'll put another link about King Philip's War in the YouTube description if you want to look it up and research that more. So something shown here is this is the Salem witch trials, and we're going to kind of talk about that. It's kind of a very interesting thing that happened in Salem. And they basically started accusing people of being witches, and then they burned some of them. So, yeah, not good. So by the 1660s, many New England towns experienced a drop-off in church membership. And so one of the things that they did, and I talked about that a little bit earlier, it was really hard to become a full member of the church. You had to have this thing called a conversion experience. And that wasn't like, hey, I believe in Jesus, now I'm converted. Not like you go down to the front of the church and say, I want to accept Jesus into my heart. It wasn't like that. You had to have an actual conversion experience. You had to be able to say, God talked to me, and this is what happened, and here's how my life is completely changed because of it. To become a member. And so not a lot of people could honestly do that. And so that the membership dropped off, and for a number of reasons, not just that. But what they did was they had a halfway covenant, which gave full membership to people who had not had that conversion experience, because they wanted to keep that membership. And so you already have at this time this kind of worry among the Puritans that our religion is getting watered down. There's too many people who aren't a part of our religion who are living among us. And it was obviously partly their problem because they wouldn't let people into their church as full members. But you already kind of have that. So getting to the Salem witch trials from that is not a kind of a far stretch to get there. Okay, so this compromise of the halfway covenant brought people back to the church, but showed the declining importance of religion in New England. People who had come over for religious reasons, their great-grandchildren were now successful merchants who were more worried about making money as a merchant than being a religious Puritan. And so that becomes kind of an issue to these hardcore Puritans in the area. And so they're just really worried about their religion and who's a part of it and who's. Religion plays a role in the Salem witch trials in 1692 when several young girls are accused of being witches. So it's caused over those tensions of who's in the church and who's not. But it's also caused by land ownership, Indian attacks, and all kinds of religious disagreements. And what happens is literally, if I was a member of the church, I could go into my minister and I could say, hey, so-and-so down the road is a witch. And I know because I saw her do whatever. Levitate off the ground. I don't know what they said, but they could just accuse anyone of being a witch. Or if you just look the wrong way, they could say, oh, you're possessed by the devil, you're a witch. And really the reason why, if I didn't like someone, or if somebody lived next to me and I wanted their land, I could just say, hey, that person's a witch, and they would potentially burn them at the stake, and I would get their land. So it's kind of a scary time frame in this area of Salem, Massachusetts, which we still have. That's still a town today, Salem, Massachusetts. But that's the area where this happened. So as a result of the trials, 19 people were killed and 150 citizens are jailed. All right, so that's the end of this lecture. Hopefully you guys learned a lot about the Pilgrims who came over at first, and then the Puritans who then followed them, and how that society and that colony grew and grew and grew until what it will be when we kind of circle back to it, and it's become really a force in the British colony system in America. All right, until next time, see you guys.